Hello, Nicole Mashburn again, and we're going to continue our lab videos. And so we're going to talk about the axial bones, continuing with the skull, but now we're going to focus on the facial bones. So again, make sure you have your lab guide with you with your list of bones and the features that you're responsible for knowing. All right, so our facial bones, these are the bones that are separate from our cranial bones. So I'm going to draw a line. And so basically the bones inside of this box are our facial bones, okay? And so again, just like with cranial bones, you may see images from the textbook or 3D computer generated images, or you may see actual skulls. So as you go through this video, take your list of bones and your textbook and try to label your bones and features, okay? And on both the images and the actual skull pictures. There are 14 facial bones, and so we're going to start with the maxilla. That's going to be our first facial bone. And so let's go back to our overall picture, and this is the maxilla. You have one on this side, and then you have one on this side, and these form your upper jaw. Okay, so these are the bones that we would consider being our upper mouth, upper jaw. So this is a side view of just one of the maxilla. And if you look at the maxilla and the features that you have to know, we have what are called alveolar processes, palatine process, an infraorbital foramen, and a maxillary sinus. Those are going to be our features. So a process, again, is just a ridge or a projection. The alveolar process, this is on the maxilla. An alveolus is a sac. So the alveolar process is this ridge that has the holes or the sacs that the teeth go in. So it's the ridge that contains the tooth sacs. That's your alveolar process. So on an exam, if I said name this bone, you would say maxilla. If I said name this feature, you would say alveolar process. Okay? Now you also have your palatine process. So if you're looking at a view from the bottom, so you're looking at an inferior view, the top of your mouth, think about, do your tongue like that. If you think about where your tongue goes, that's your hard palate, okay, the palate of the roof of your mouth. Well, your hard palate, the roof of your mouth, is actually made up of four bones. You have one, two, three, four bones that are fused together to form that hard palate. The front two-thirds of the hard palate are actually the palatine processes of the maxilla. So you have the palatine process from one maxilla and the palatine process from another maxilla form the front two-thirds of your hard palate. Okay, the back third is actually another set of bones called the palatine bones. So again, if I said name this bone, I would say that's the maxilla. If I said name this feature, I'm talking about the palatine processes. All right. Okay, you have your infraorbital foramen. So orbital means the eye, infra means below, foramen means hole. So the infraorbital foramen are the little circles, the little openings, just inferior of the eye sockets. Okay? And then lastly, you do have some maxillary sinuses, and there are going to be these open spaces inside the bone. And so they're right above the alveolar processes. That's why if you have a sinus infection, sometimes your teeth hurt. So you have these open spaces that are sinus filled or sinus areas, and that's one of the reasons you can get a headache when you have, or a toothache when you have a sinus infection. So again, you can look. We'll talk a little bit more about sinuses as we move through these these lectures. All right. So the next bone is your mandible, and this was what you would call your lower jaw. Okay, and so the mandible is the only bone of the skull that is completely disarticulated from the rest of the skull. So it's connected with a joint, but it's not actually connected with a suture. So remember, all your other bones of the cranium, the cranial bones, the facial bones, all the bones of the skull, they're glued together with those suture lines, whereas the mandible is independent. Okay, you just have an articular joint between the mandible and the temporal bone, but there's no actual suture there, which is nice because your lower jaw needs to move. It can't be sutured in place. It needs to have mobility. So when you're looking at the mandible, there's one mandible, and so you have what's called the mandibular body, which this would be just the main lower part of the mandible. You have the ramus, which is this arm portion. So if you were to hold the mandible, this area would be the ramus. The angle is what connects the ramus to the body. All right, and then you have two condyles. You have your mandibular condyle here, and then you have a mandibular condyle here. Remember, condyle means a rocker, and so the mandibular condyles will fit into the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. So the mandibular condyles will fit into the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, and that forms your TMJ, your temporomandibular joint. Okay, so that's where that word comes from. When someone says they have TMJ, it's from temporomandibular. You have a coronoid process, so the anterior portion of the ramus has this pointy end. That's your coronoid process. That comes from the word like coronation, like to crown. So it looks like little crown points. So those are your coronoid processes. You have alveolar processes on the mandible just as you did on the maxilla because you have teeth on the bottom. So your alveolar process on the mandible is where the tooth sacs are on the bottom jaw. And then you have some foramen. You have a mental foramen, so there's two mental foramen, one on either side. So remember, mental means chin, so foramen is whole. So you have two mental foramen on either side of your mandible. And then the mandibular foramen is going to be on the inside of the ramus, and there's one on each side. That's your mandibular foramen. So again, as you look at the exam questions, if it says name the bone, it will be mandible. If it says name this feature, it's either going to be the body or the ramus or the angle or the mandibular condyles, the coronoid process, the alveolar process, the mandibular foramen, or the mental foramen. All right, so we've got an actual bone here, so let's see if we can identify some of these features once again. So this would be the body of the mandible, right? Here would be our angle, our mandibular condyles, our coronoid processes here and here, the mental foramen, and then the mandibular foramen is going to be in here. I like this particular view because you can see them. You're looking from the back, and so you can see the mandibular foramen here, as well as the coronoid process and the mandibular condyles. So remember, again, I can take these bones and I can turn them in all different directions and angles. So think about these in 3D. And again, when you watch the videos by Ms. Graham, that will also help you put this together. All right, the next bone is the zygomatic bone, and the zygomatic bone forms the prominence of your cheek. It would be known as your cheekbone. And so the zygomatic bone is this blue bone here, here, and here. You have two of them, and so they form the prominence of your cheek, but they also form a part of the orbit of the eye. Okay, so it's not only part of your cheek, but it also is where it forms this circular orbit where your eye would go. Remember, the zygomatic bone will join the temporal bone to form this zygomatic arch. The zygomatic bone joins with the suture the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. There are no features for the zygomatic bone. You just simply have to be able to identify it. Okay, and so this would be the zygomatic bone on this skeleton here. So we're going to zoom in to the orbit because we're looking for the lacrimal bone. And it's a little hard to see on this one. The lacrimal bone is a little bone right here. It's between this is your nasal bone. Between your nasal bone and in the orbit of the eye, you have this lacrimal bone. There's a better view, again, in your textbook. But what I want you to notice about the lacrimal duct, or the lacrimal bone, is there's a lacrimal duct here. So we call this our maybe our tear duct. And when you're crying, your tears are formed up here in the kind of above your eye. Your tear glands are going to be up here in the tissue on the outside superior surface of the orbit of the eye. And so when you cry, the tears are going to fall into the eye, and as you blink, it's going to wash those tears over to the nasolacrimal duct. And so your tears are formed in the tear gland, but they drain to the tear duct. And the lacrimal duct is continuous with your pharynx. So that's why when you cry, you get that watery snot that drains to the back of your throat, okay? Because, again, your nasolacrimal duct is connected to your pharynx. So again, the lacrimal bone is just deep to the maxilla. So you have your nasal bone, your maxilla, and your lacrimal bone is going to be right here. I use an image when I can that's color coordinated so you can see it a little better, or one of those computer generated images where I can highlight it. So again, take some time to look at the different images available to you so you'll be ready for it on the test. Again, it's just a little sliver of a bone just on either side of the nasal bone. Here we go. Here's a picture right here. So this green one right there, that would be your lacrimal bone. So you can see it there, and you can see it on this one, this little square piece right there. Again, your lacrimal bone. And your lacrimal duct would be just there. All right, what else can we talk about? Oh, I want to talk about the orbit of the eye. So here's the orbit of the eye, and I want you to notice all these colors. We have many, many colors, and so each one of these different colors is representing a different bone. And I need you guys on your own, because this is kind of something I want you to investigate, how many bones form the orbit. It's in your book. It's not a hard question to figure out. But I want you guys to do this on your own. So do a little investigation. So figure out how many bones make up the orbit, and then I want you to be able to identify it. So I'll just tell you, this one's the frontal, and this is zygomatic, and this one is your maxilla. So see if you can figure out the rest of them. So I've given you 3, but there's several more. So you figure out how many there are and be able to identify them. I can guarantee you'll see something like that on your lab test. All right, so the next bone is your palatine bone. And so again, like I mentioned before, your hard palate is the roof of your mouth. So the back 1/3 of the hard palate is made up of these 2 bones. There's 1, 2 palatine bones. So each one of these little green bones is a palatine bone. Here's one of those computer generated images to kind of give you a 3D effect on that. And then here's a real skull. So this is your palatine bone there. So again, look in your textbook and look in as many images as you can so that you can identify the palatine bone in one of these aspects. So either the computer generated or the image or an actual skeleton. All right, the nasal bone. The nasal bone is what we call maybe the bridge of our nose, or it's kind of the top part, the hard part of our nose. What gives our nose the shape is cartilage actually, but the bony structure at the top, this blue bone, that's the nasal bone. And there are 2 of them, a left and a right. So if you look at this image, this little bitty bone here, that is your nasal bone. And so again, you have a left and a right one that fuse together to form the kind of the top bridge of your nose. Then you have your vomer. This is going to be our last bone, or one of our last bones. We have one of these. So again, we're looking at the nose again. So this is going to be the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. This is cartilage. This is the fleshy part of your nose that makes your septum of your nose, and that you can actually see and kind of twitch and bend. So this is that cartilage that's part of your nose. So behind that is another bone that makes up the perpendicular plate or the septum of your nose called the vomer. And you can't really see the vomer very well unless you're looking at the skull from this direction or have it cut in half. So I've got the next picture to show you. If you're looking at the skull from the front, this top half here, this is going to be the ethmoid bone, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and this bone is the vomer. Okay, so that would be your vomer bone. So you'll either see it on a skeleton or either cut away as something like that. All right, and the last thing we've got to talk about are your remember those turbinate bones we talked about earlier? You can see it a little better in this image. So you have the swirly bone here, then one here, and one here. These are your inferior nasal conchae, okay? And if you remember, we talked about the medial and the superior ones. They're way up here. Those are part of another bone, but your inferior nasal conchae are separate bones. So your inferior nasal conchae are one of the 3 pairs of turbinate bones, and they're the ones that you can most readily see on the skeleton. So as we are moving on, let me just see if I can do a quick review with you. Do you remember what these are called? Well, it's below the eye, and it's a hole, so infraorbital foramen. Remember that? Here would be your nasal bones right here. This would be the maxilla. This would be a maxilla. Here's a zygomatic bone. Be the frontal bone. If I look back into the back of the eye, the evil eye, there's the sphenoid bone there and there. So again, as you're looking at these different pictures, try to identify the bones in as many images as you can so you'll be ready for the exam. All right, and the last thing I want to talk about are those sinuses. I've mentioned them several times, but again, the sinuses are inside the bone, so unless you take a bone and cut it apart, they're hard to see. But these sinuses are areas of hollow, where hollow bone is, and they're lined with a mucous membrane. That's where the snot comes from. So when you have a cold and you've got a sinus infection, that's where all that mucus is coming from. And so you have frontal sinuses in your frontal bone. You have ethmoid sinuses here in your ethmoid bone. You have sphenoidal sinuses that are just behind that, and then you have your maxillary sinuses. So typically when we have headaches and a cold and allergies, it's going to be your maxillary sinuses or frontal sinuses. That's where you're going to get a lot of that pain and a lot of that snot and things coming from those sinuses. So that's where your sinuses are. So again, usually if I'm going to test you on the sinuses, instead of it being on a bone picture, it'll be on a diagram more like this. So you'll need to be able to identify the maxillary, sphenoidal, ethmoid, and frontal sinuses using an image. Okay, so that is all that there is about the facial bones, and I will talk to you again in the next video. Thank you very much.